What's up, guys? In this video I'm going to be grinding a Platinum Preppy fine nib into a stub nib, and while I'm doing this I figured I would also kind of discuss one of the reasons why I really prefer fountain pens over other pens, and that's the level of customization and the writing experience you can get. You know, with fountain pens you can get them sent to nibmeisters and they can tune and adjust it to however you like, especially if you do it in person and you can give the person working on your nib instant feedback, and then they can take a look at how you're writing and then correct things on the spot versus having to mail it back and forth. You know, you can basically get a pen to write exactly how you want. Or, you know, in this case, like I am doing it by myself, you can, you know, change the amount of feedback that you get. I'm just going to start working. First of all, I guess I'll go into a little bit of my setup. Right here I have the Spyderco Sharp Maker with fine ceramic rods, and then I have 3 different grits of micro mesh here. I have a 6,000, 8,000, and a 12,000 grit pad. In general, with most nib work, you'll really, you know, if you're smoothing out the nib or anything, you'll only need the micro mesh. In this case, I have a fine Platinum Preppy that I want to grind into a stub. And in order to save time, I'm going to actually just use a more aggressive abrasive to grind away some of the tipping material first. The only reason why I'm grinding this into a stub is because one of my friends asked me to do it. Well, actually I kind of offered. You know, recently I kind of really got into doing like nib work and grinding nibs and smoothing them out and stuff. So, you know, I'm just using this as practice. I'm going to have a few Pelican M200 steel nibs come in, hopefully in a week, and you know, I'll be customizing 2 of those nibs for 2 of my friends and 1 of the nibs for myself. And I figured, well, you know, I might as well get some more practice in. Obviously, nib units for M200s are not cheap. They're around like $35 a piece. Meanwhile, your Platinum Preppies are like a few dollars, $3 to $5, depending on where you buy them, and a lot easier to swallow the cost of messing up. You know, I'm not a professional nibmeister, and how I do things, you know, by hand and everything probably isn't the best way of doing things, but it works. Wow, this is really, really squeaky to grind. Obviously, when you're grinding a nib, you want to constantly check on it, make sure you're not overdoing things. You know, I have ground a few nibs. You know, honestly, I'm probably going to go to a coarser grit. I have ground a few nibs previously on some of my cheaper pens with steel nibs. Not, you know, I haven't really messed too much with grinding my gold nib pens yet, and they have not all been successful. In all honesty, most of them have had a lot of their tipping ground down, you know, more than what you probably should. But at the same time, they're steel nibs, so I'm not overly concerned. You know, I can always buy replacements. I reground TWSBI VAX 700 as well as the Edison Collier, and new nib units for those pens are only $25, which, I mean, I guess is a lot of money, but compared to something like a gold nib, it's not as bad. Right now what I'm doing is I'm basically flattening out the ball tipping that's on this nib right now. Oh. I'm just gonna first flatten out the very tip of it slightly. Trying to do it as evenly as possible. Fortunately, this isn't the flattest of work surfaces. Probably let me just, you know, just angle it accordingly. I gotta just check on what I'm doing here. Yeah, so I have to angle this slightly. I'm using excuse me. I am using a triplet loop, 10 times triplet loop, to check my work occasionally as I go through it. I apologize if I don't really talk too much while I do this, but I am kind of trying to concentrate a little bit. But the concept of grinding a nib isn't overly difficult. You know, basically you have the tipping material on there, and you're going to use an abrasive to grind away and shape whatever tipping you want. And then once you get the tipping to whatever shape you want, it's just a matter of smoothing it out. Obviously, if you're using a very aggressive abrasive to remove material, it's not going to leave the most polished of surfaces on the tipping material, and that'll cause the nib to write with a lot of feedback. You know, it'll feel really scratchy when you're writing with it. So, you know, that's when the micro mesh comes into play, and then you go through multiple levels of grit until you get it to this amount of polish that you want, and the more polished the nib is, the smoother it'll write. And let me just... Oops. I think I was grinding a little bit at the feed. Yep. That's why I wasn't grinding so aggressively. I was actually grinding away at the plastic feed. Like I said, I'm not a professional or anything. I'm just kind of got interested in it, and you know, obviously you will want to practice with some cheaper pens. You know, you can buy like $1 or $2 cheap fountain pens from China on eBay and stuff and practice on those. And you know, that's one of the things about fountain pens, is that you don't necessarily have to buy a very expensive pen to get a very smooth writing experience. You know, you can easily buy, like, you know, a lot of people recommend TWSBIs for people who are looking for like a next step, you know, beginners who are looking at a next step in fountain pens. And TWSBI pens are great, but I feel like the nibs themselves aren't the best. They're not the smoothest or anything. And they will require some work in order to get them to write very smoothly. You know, meanwhile, that's not to say that more expensive pens don't have to get tuned. You know, a lot of the quality control coming out of pen manufacturers nowadays, even for expensive pens, has not been that great. You know, I love I love Pelican pens. You know, I personally own a 600 and a 650, and I adore them. You know, they're the 600 series is basically my favorite pen. But you know, I will have to admit, the nib that I got out of my 600 was not that great. It was, you know, the tines were misaligned, and I had to work on them to get the pen to write as well as I would like. So, you know, you do have to keep that in mind. At the same time, you know, those pens do offer a slightly different writing experience that isn't just a matter of smoothness or anything, but just the feel of it. And it, you know, it just so happens that Pelican nibs, specifically with the 600 series that I have, you know, I really like, and has become basically my favorite style of pen. So at this point, I've basically flattened out the very tip of the nib as well as the bottom ball of the nib. And then because the tipping was a round ball to begin with, and so long as I don't have the two ends of the grind meet each other, I should still be left with a slightly rounded corner, which is what I'm going for. Because I'm trying to go for a stub grind and not a sharp italic grind, I don't necessarily want the two ends of the grinds to meet into a sharp point, because that'll basically kind of dig into the paper a little bit and make it a little more difficult to write smoothly with. You know, obviously with an italic nib, it'll have very sharp corners, and I'll give you really nice line variations because those corners are so sharp. But at the same time, you know, it requires a lighter hand, better nib placement against the paper in order to get a smooth writing experience. Versus with a stub that's more rounded, you don't really have as much of a problem. Let me check on the camera actually. Okay, good. This camera can only record in half-hour intervals, so I have to make sure I don't go over the time and start just talking to myself. You know, as you're doing this, you're gonna want to check your work. So, as you can see here, maybe, hopefully, let me see if I can get it to focus. I'm just wasting time now. There we go. You can see here, as I go from left to right, the strokes are a lot thinner, and as I go up and down, the line width is a lot thicker. It's basically what you want out of a stub. You know, the size of the stub, the size of the line variation will depend on how much you grind away. But I think I am at a point where I am pretty happy with the line variation. So I will go ahead and move on to next level of polishing. As I was writing with that, it felt very, very coarse and was not smooth at all. But obviously that's because I was using the medium grit Sharpmaker ceramic stone, and that does not leave a very polished surface. So at this point right now, I'm going to go ahead and use the fine surface to basically kind of remove some of the scratch pattern that's on the nib currently. I kind of take it akin to like knife sharpening. You know, I was into knives much longer than I was into fountain pens, and you know, I learned to freehand sharpen very early on. And it's kind of the same concept. You know, in knife sharpening, you want to grind away material to get to a nice sharp edge. But at the same time, you know, if you want a sharper knife, one that doesn't really catch as much as you slice through paper or whatever you happen to be cutting, then you want a more polished edge. And in order to get that, you would go up in progressive grits. Obviously, as you can see here, I do use a Sharpmaker. You know, and then for really removing metal, I also have DMT stones that are diamond impregnated steel plates basically, and that allows me to remove metal at a much faster rate, but at the same time it leaves a much coarser finish on the edge, which will lead to kind of like, as you slice paper, it'll kind of catch on the edge and leave a more ragged edge, and it'll require more force to actually cut through something. So, basically, like sharpening a knife, I want to polish up the surface that I was grinding as much as possible, and you kind of get a feel for that based off of the sound you hear against the grinding and the feedback that you get in your hands and your fingertips. You know, as you grind a steel surface over and over again, as it gets smoother, you'll feel less feedback in cutting into it. Now obviously if you have something very coarse, it'll continuously cut into material that you're trying to grind, and you won't really feel much of a difference. But with finer grits, you will actually feel it. And unfortunately, I feel like I ground a little too much. Because what happened was, as I went to the finer grit, it was still removing a lot of material. And I kind of met up the corners of the two ends of the grind a little bit. So I will, as a stub, I will have to smooth that out, which I will do on this fine stone before I move to the micro mesh to kind of remove material as fast as possible. But at the same time, I'll have to check my work a lot more often. Right now I'm just rocking the nib back and forth along the different writing angles to try and smooth out any rough corners that I may have. There we go, that looks pretty good. I just want to do more smoothing at a higher angle. For me, I write with a pretty low writing angle. So where this is at now works for me, but not everyone writes at the same angle. Some people will write higher, some people will write lower. So that's one of the more difficult things about nib grinding, as I've found, is that in order to get a nib that'll write well for everyone, it has to be very rounded, and that's very difficult to do when you're grinding on flat surfaces, or you know, if you're like me and you're not really doing it professionally or anything. I'm just gonna clean this up. Let me quickly check the time. Okay, I've gone through half of my filming time, but that was the most time-consuming part, you know, grinding away as much material as possible. Hopefully the smoothing won't take as long. Here I'm starting with the 6000 grit. I have an ink syringe here that I just have some water in. The micro mesh is best used with water. And then basically, you know, a lot of people like to do figure eights, which kind of works out. I mean, in honesty, I feel like you just go in circles. And because with this type of micro mesh, that it is spongy, the nib will sink down into the surface a little bit. And you should hit all the corners that you need to. But, I guess it never hurts to do some figure eights, I guess. 6000 grit will still remove material quite quickly. So you do want to be careful with that and how much you grind. I'm just kind of basically try and dig into the surface a little bit and try and smooth out any corners that I might have formed when I was doing a flat circle. Oop. Wipe that down. Check my work. That looks pretty good. Gonna go ahead and do some figure eights just for posterity. Hopefully I'm in frame, actually. I kind of have the camera at a different angle than what I usually have it at. Just because I need to kind of hunch over a little bit and not have a tripod in my way of seeing what I'm actually doing in this case. So hopefully this angle works out. Hopefully it's not too disoriented or anything. Just... And like with the sharper grits, you know, as you progress through the grits, you will feel that there's less resistance as the abrasive, you know, isn't fine enough to really do any grinding against the material. What's it called? That came out poorly phrased. You know, as you match the scratch pattern or the polish on the metal, it'll basically stop cutting as effectively, and you know, you'll feel that by the fact that it'll kind of not catch as much against the grit, and you'll know that it's time to move on. Go at a lower angle as well. Basically now I'm just doing figure eights just for the ease of it. You know, I do find that circular motions a lot easier to go up and down on. You know, maybe you want to go clockwise or counterclockwise. I don't necessarily think it matters, in my opinion, but You just kind of move the nib however you feel like it, I guess. However you think is actually shaping the nib. Alright, so far so good. Just gonna polish up a little more. Once you get to the level of the 12,000 grit, you're not really going to be removing that much material, so you want to get as much grinding as possible done on the earlier grits. At the same time, like I said, you do have to be careful about grinding away too much of the tipping material. For steel nibs, it's not as big of a deal, but with gold nibs, you know, the reason why gold nibs won't wear away faster than steel nibs is because of the fact that the tipping material is probably the same. I guess if you want to call it iridium. I don't know if it's necessarily iridium or not anymore. But that's also one of the reasons why people say that, you know, a gold nib will not necessarily be smoother than a steel nib, because what makes contact with the paper is the tipping material, and that can be basically be the same for both styles of nib. But with a steel nib, if you wear away too much of the tipping material, it's not as big of a deal because steel nib is still quite hard and it won't really abrade away as fast as gold will. So, you know, obviously with a gold nib pen, you'll want to make sure you have tipping material making contact with the paper and not the gold itself. It's actually my first time doing a stub, so it'll be interesting to see how this turns out. In the past, I've basically just kind of ground like an offset angled foot onto the nib that basically matched my handwriting angle, so that, you know, it would be very smooth. And because with the micro mesh, it's not completely flat foot, it's slightly rounded, but not, you know, you can't really adjust the angle of it too much before you feel that the pen writes scratchy. But if you want to do nib work for someone else, like I said, unless you can actually just take a look directly at what they're writing at, you know, what angle they're writing at and whatnot, you do kind of have to make it more of a general grind that's very friendly for a large variety of writing angles. How much time do I have left? 7 minutes. Alright. So far, so good. Looks like it's going well. Just clean that off and go to the next. Finally, I'm down to the 12,000. And this is the final polishing level I have. You know, obviously you go higher if you want to, but I honestly feel that at 12,000 grit, the nibs basically come out super buttery smooth, and like there's really no need to go any higher. I think that if at 12,000, if you still feel that the nib is scratchy, more than likely it's either the paper itself is just very rough and the nib is catching against the paper, or you have some kind of burr or misaligned tine that's kind of catching along the paper and causing it to kind of scratch a little bit or feel scratchy. If you do have a burr on the nib, you'll basically want to kind of remove it with something like an 8,000 grit. Just because I feel like 12,000 may actually just be a little too smooth to effectively remove burrs. You know, like with knife sharpening, you get the largest burr with the coarser grits, and if the burr is obviously too large, going up to a very high polish will not necessarily remove the burr very effectively. That's why, like, when you sharpen knives, you can't necessarily go from like a 400 grit diamond plate to, you know, ultra fine ceramic rods or anything, just because the burr will be so large that the ultra fine ceramic rod won't be able to take away that burr, and it'll effectively ruin your cutting performance. You know, as soon as you cut something harder than that thin wire edge, it'll basically break that burr off and you'll be left with a dull knife again. Same principle with pen nibs, I feel, in that if you do form a burr on there and you don't remove the burr effectively, you'll basically be left with like a sharp surface that will cut into your writing surface and make it feel not so smooth. So let me just quickly take a look. And it looks pretty good so far. I'm just gonna kind of test write it. I should probably test write it a lot more as I go, but like I said, I'm kind of in a rush, so. Nice. So as you can see here, you know, if I write with a good writing angle, it writes just fine. If I angle it like drastically, like 45 degrees, it won't write anymore. I can write upside down pretty well too. It does scratch a little bit, which I feel I won't have time to really the actual writing part isn't so bad. I definitely feel like I probably still have a sharp corner. Yeah, see, like if I angle it as much this way, I do have a sharp corner on the very edges. So, you know, basically if you look at your standard ball from the side, if it's like this, is that even in frame? Yeah, that's kind of in frame. What I basically did was I ground away this tip part here, and then I also ground away this bottom tip here. So what I'm left with is a squared off nib. This back end is still a little rounded actually, like so. And what happens is if you catch this if you just catch on this very tip of the two corners, you'll feel like it writes very scratchy. Obviously if you're angling more towards the bottom or the top flat part, then it won't really make contact with the paper well, and you feel like it's not writing very well. So you want to kind of do, at least for a stub, in my opinion, is you do kind of want to round it off a little bit, but still have it relatively squared off, so you do get that line variation. So you basically see here, like compared to like a traditional ball, this is a little more squared off, a little rounder, and it does give you decent line variation. This is a fine nib, so you're not going to really see as much of the line variation as you would with a broader nib that you grind down to a stub. But focus. So you can see here, there's a little bit of line variation. Like I said, because it's a fine nib, it's a little more difficult to see. But when I go from left to right, it's a much finer line, and then when I go up and down, it's a slightly thicker line. So that's really all about all the time I have for recording on this video. Hope you guys enjoyed watching a half-hour video of me mumbling and grinding away at a pen nib. I'm probably going to do a little more work on this to try and smooth it out. Honestly, I feel like Platinum Preppies, the material that the tipping is used, isn't necessarily the best and will actually require a lot of grinding and polishing to smooth out. But definitely with higher quality nibs, it works out to be a lot better. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Hope you found it somewhat educational. Remember, like as a end disclaimer, I guess, if you work on your own nibs, be prepared to pay the consequences if you accidentally screw them up. So yeah, hope you guys enjoyed this, and thanks for